Good afternoon. I'm John Fortier. I'm a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to be here with Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, to have a discussion about many things going on in our world of elections. Let me lay out a couple of ground rules for how this hour is going to work. Then I'll introduce the Secretary, and then we're going to jump right into it, both talking generally about elections and also about a very interesting piece that he's written recently for National Affairs. The ground rules are that we're going to talk for a while, but we're also looking for your questions. And so if you would like to submit a question, you can do so in two ways. One is by emailing Nicole Penn, that's nicole.penn, P-E-N-N, at aei.org. Or secondly, with Twitter, with the Twitter hashtag AEI elections. So either way, we're looking for your questions. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to try to hear from you and hear what's on your mind. So let me introduce Secretary Raffensperger. He is someone who is well known to the American people, maybe more well known than he would have expected running for office at the first time. He's become a household name given our elections in the last few months. But Secretary Raffensperger started was CEO of a successful engineering company in Georgia, was involved in local politics at the elective level at city council and then the Georgia House of Representatives. And then a little background, which will feed into, I think, his piece. He ran for Secretary of State in 2018, won in both the primary and general elections. I think he faced a runoff, and many Americans know about the Georgia runoff system now more than they did before the last election. And at the same time as that election, there was another election going on for governor. The former Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, was running against Stacey Abrams. And that election ended with Brian Kemp being elected governor, but some controversy about the election results, just as Secretary Raffensperger was taking office. And then, of course, all the controversies that people know about the 2020 presidential election and the state of Georgia and the role of the secretary in those controversies. So, welcome, Secretary Raffensperger. What I'd really like to do is to begin with your piece and plug your piece because I think people should read it. He's written a new piece for National Affairs. National Affairs is a journal. It has a AEI association. It's edited by Yuval Levin, who's also heads our section on social, cultural, and constitutional affairs at AEI. And that piece just came out in the spring 2021 issue, and it's entitled "The Assault on Trust in Our Elections." And I won't give it all away, but it does look, of course, at issues relating to the 2020 election and trust and belief in the election results. But it also begins in 2018 with the election that I just discussed with Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. In fact, I think the one phrase that stuck out for me was that you felt a sense of deja vu when you were reliving the 2018 election in a sense. In 2020. So tell us a little bit about your piece, why you wrote it, and why you're worried about trust in our elections.
If you didn't live in Georgia, when you saw the results of what happened after the November 2020 election and after President Trump came up short in the election totals, and you saw that beginning that election disinformation, misinformation campaign, you'd have thought that was a new strategy that people have come up with. But here in Georgia, we had seen this back in 2018. After Stacey Abrams lost the election by nearly 60,000 votes against now Governor, Brian Kemp, she began this great narrative, and her narrative was really, it was two sides of the same coin, but it was her narrative was voter suppression. And President Trump's, it was actually voter fraud, but it's really two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't trust the election results, that somehow for them to have lost, it had to have been the election process. It had nothing to do with how many votes actually were counted. And so we began my term in 2019 with a host of lawsuits and then a whole bunch of new lawsuits that we received from Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams organizations. But if you look at what she said after she had lost the election, she said, "We will not concede." How could you concede when you know that the results were not fair? And so that really began a 2-year process, and she leveraged that into her organizations, Fair Fight probably being number one of those, raising over $90 million and then showering other candidates throughout the country with $66 million so far has been expended because of her narrative has been very profitable for her. roll that into 2020, we saw very similar, systems and disinformation processes that took place. Both of them said that the machines were not accurate. But see, in 2018, we had the old electronic paperless DRE machines that dated back to about 2002, 2003 when they're put into place. We have new verifiable paper ballot systems, but at this time, the 2020 results, President Trump said they were flipping votes, that they could not be trusted. There were thousands and thousands of votes. So in Georgia, after the 2020 election results, what we did is we did 100% hand recount, and then we also did an electronic count of all those ballots. We ran them through the scanners again, and we got basically with all three counts virtually the same results to verify that the machines were accurate. But from that standpoint, there's a lot of similarities between that, and it's really, unfortunately, what it does is it destroys confidence. When you destroy confidence in the election process, in effect, what you're doing is taking a shot at the very heart of democracy, because it's really supposed to be one vote, one count, accurate, and making sure that it's a fair election. We've worked hard at Georgia, making sure that everyone understands that we have fair elections, that we have record turnout. We've also have record registrations, and we also have one of the largest amounts of early voting that we see. It's very generous in Georgia. With Senate Bill 202 that was just passed, we increased it by 1 day. We now have 17 days of early voting from 16, plus 2 days of Sunday voting for any county that wants to do that. But there's been a host of misinformation, disinformation, and both of them have very large megaphones, and it's tough to really beat that back when their megaphones are huge, and what our office has is the limited resources that we do have. So we speak out to that, we speak the truth. We're hopefully going to talk about S1 today, but we had the invitation and then it was pulled away from us. The Senate, I guess, wanted to really go along with the Stacey Abrams narrative. They thought that played better for what they want to accomplish with S1 and HR1. We want to make sure that people understand that it's never been easier to vote in Georgia. We have appropriate guidelines in place, but also we want to make sure that elections moving forward are looked at from a bipartisan nature. Every candidate has to put their best foot forward. They have to win the election on their merits, but they need to understand in Georgia, you're going to have a fair election process. We're going to make sure that happens.
So let me ask you, what the line is that you think that both Stacey Abrams and Donald Trump crossed. Obviously, we're allowed to question our elections, to call for recounts, to look for irregularities, to speak out. But is there a certain point in time or a certain set of actions that you would say this is too far? This is where it goes beyond what is well protected, the ability of candidates to really advocate for themselves and their results. And when it goes too far, when it really is corrosive to elections, and feel free to use examples from either of the cases that you bring up.
Well, I would say that what happened in the case of Stacey Abrams, not a single thing that she postulated, put forward, is based in fact. In fact, we've responded to her point by point. Recently, a Superior Court U.S. federal judge, appointed by Obama's, Steve Jones, has, threw out many of her claims, which we were actually looking forward to getting that before the court so we could once conclusively just knock it down, because she's been running around for 2 years. But we need to go back to 2014. She poll tested, what would be a really hot button issues. And one of the things that came out of that was the word voter suppression. And so she's been running that narrative since 2016, 2018, 2020. That's her narrative. It's been a great money raising system for that. It's a great emotional hook on voters. She talked about how precincts have been closed, and Secretary of State had something to do with that. Secretary of State's office does not do that. We have 159 counties. Counties run elections, and the counties set where they're going to have precinct locations, where they're going to have polling locations. The two locations she complained about the most were Fulton and DeKalb County. Those are run by Democrats. And so her own party would have been suppressing the votes if there's any truth to that. But precincts change over time because of where the demand is located. But if there's an issue, they need to take it up with their local poll managers, the local county election officials, which happen to be put in place by Democrats. She also talked about, cleaning up the voter rolls. Right now, we have about 7.7 million people that are on the voter rolls. What people haven't talked about is that we have a very mobile society. Pew did a study and said about 11% of all Americans move every year. If you take 7.7 million people times 11%, that's 850,000 Georgians that move every year. We don't know if they moved within the precinct, out of the precinct, within the county, out of the county, or they moved out of state, or they're moving into the state. The point is, there's a lot of movement of people, and it is something that we need to do to clean up the voter rolls. We joined ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, that is set up by the states. So it's really each state joins. There's about 30 states now: Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina. It's blue states, red states that are members of this, so we can objectively clean up our voter rolls. She said that we were doing it just arbitrarily, but that did not withstand the scrutiny of the court. And a 2019 ruling says that what we're doing follows, really standard practice in many other states.
You raised the question of whether people can trust our elections, or that you were worried that people are starting to distrust them, candidates in particular. I don't think this is just a policy question, but can you discuss some of the policy questions, election administration questions around having a good recount, having a good, transparent, quick resolution of the election? Obviously, we had an election run under the COVID pandemic that posed more problems, but maybe more generally, I can think back to 2000. Of course, 2000 election was a very famous recount, and frankly, I think states after the fact didn't think enough about their recount processes, their counting processes, and opening them up to the public. So what can you say about what you would do or what you're doing that reassures people through the process that things are going to get resolved, counted, and results will be seen by all within a reasonable amount of time?
Well, number one, in the time that we had actually done 3 counts of those ballots, Der Spiegel or some German publication sent a friend posted in Germany, sent to our state election board member that we already had done 3 counts in the time that 20 states still hadn't even finished their count, the first count. So we actually were very quick on that. The challenge we had in Georgia is that the delta was so close, 12,000 votes, that it really did matter. But we did a 100% hand recount of every single verifiable paper ballot. So on that ballot, we didn't go ahead and recount the QR code. We looked at, did it say President Bush, or did it say Vice President Biden, or did it say the Libertarian candidate? And that's what was recounted. We did a 100% recount of those ballots that we had. And when we verified that, of those 4 million ballots, we got back virtually the same answer. Then we went ahead, and after the election was certified, the losing candidate can ask for a recount. And that would then be run through the machines, through the scanners again. We got virtually the same result. So those ballots would be caught first time, then with 100% hand recount, and then a scanned recount. And the results were virtually the same. Nothing that would ever change the results. So that answered the question about the accuracy of the equipment. Then every rumor that was thrown out by the Trump campaign surrogates, including the ones thrown out by Sidney Powell, we went and checked. Instead of thousands of dead people that voted, we have found 2 people that have died, and someone voted in their place. And we're trying to find out who that is. But that's 2, not 5,000, not 10,000. And so that wasn't enough. We had not a single underage voter vote in the state of Georgia. You can register to vote when you're 17. You can't vote until you turn 18. And when they threw out that data that there were all these underage voters, not a single underage voter voted in the state of Georgia.
So I'm going to remind people that for the question period, you can send questions to by email to nicole.penn, PENN, @aei.org, or with Twitter to AEI elections, with the hashtag AEI elections. We've already gotten some questions, and a number of them are along these lines that you've been talking. And I'll summarize them because there are many, and they're all in the same area. But they ask about whether you will have a transparent audit, whether the batch sheets matched up with the accounting, questions about the chain of custody of ballots. So you addressed part of that, but maybe take on these questions more specifically. What do you say about that, and what do you say about what you've done in relation to those questions?
Well, we've established, the counties provided us all the data points. We established chain of custody for every county in Georgia except 3. And there were actually 3 smaller counties. they represented about 0.3% of the total vote count, and they'll be sanctioned and brought before the state election board for prosecution. But the large counties, Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, Gwinnett, all the large metro counties have established full chain of custody and given us documentation on that. So that's a very powerful point that people need to be aware of.
So we ran this 2020 election during a global pandemic. I'm sure that's not exactly what you signed up for when you ran for office, but you as an election official had to run it under these conditions. So can you say something about running an election under COVID, both what was done, what might have been done better, but then also going forward, what's going to stick, the changes that we made, what kinds of things are likely to stay around, and what kind of things were just temporary and just needed for this election where we were under duress?
Well, during the pandemic, we did stand up an online portal. A form of that really ended up being utilized for the absentee ballot process. And the new bill that was passed, SB 202, I think that the best thing that was the biggest item there was something that I ran on in 2018, was moving away from signature match because it is subjective. And everyone that's listening to this needs to understand, we were sued both by the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. Both of them said it was a subjective measure. I agree. And that's what I said when I ran in 2018. I said we need to go to driver's license number, which is very objective. And that's what SB 202 does. I wish we would have done it sooner, but they finally, the General Assembly has joined me in that. And we're now having something that's very objective. Driver's license number with your birth date, day, month, year. And that way we can verify that it truly is that voter that it says they are. We can verify their identity. And that's a good change that we're going to be implementing. We did that with the online portal last year in the fall election. I think that was a very good implementation. The other thing is we actually been working on giving the counties very good objective measures. We have a new system. It does take longer to vote when you have a verifiable paper ballot. You got to press all, go through your choices, print it out, verify your choice. It takes a bit more time. And so the counties can't have, quote, the same efficiency as with the old paperless DRE. So we've told them, well, you need to make sure you have enough equipment, or you need to increase your number of precincts. In the November election on Tuesday, we had a 2-minute wait time. But now we put into state law that you cannot have a longer than 1 hour wait time during the day. And by doing that, we're going to make sure that we have an objective way, we have a verifiable and accountable way of making sure counties never go back to having long lines again. If they have long lines, they're going to have to increase the number of poll workers, increase the number of polling locations, or increase the amount of equipment they have in a polling location. And that way we can hold the counties accountable, because at the end of the day, we want our voters to have a great voting experience. We've also shortened the runoff. I am the runoff king in Georgia. I've been in 4 of them. But the challenge we had in January is we had to move our state runoff to coincide with the federal runoff, because we had a 4-week runoff with an 8-week runoff. Now with going with ranked choice voting for overseas ballots, we'll be able to have a 4-week runoff for everyone and get results much quicker in December instead of pushing it out to January.
So we've been talking about elections in all sorts of ways, and maybe I can frame this question as, what do you think about the role of federal law, federal legislation versus state legislation and local administration? More specifically, obviously, we have before the Congress a bill in the House, HR 1, and a comparable bill in the Senate as well. And of course, we've had a law recently passed in Georgia, which you referred to. So, give us some thoughts a little bit about what the balance should be between federal mandates. We do legislate on certain areas, but we have mostly left it to the states. Should that change? And then maybe your thoughts broadly about HR 1 and some more thoughts about the Georgia law.
I think the Constitution is very clear, as originally written, that really it was delegated really and put down to the legislatures in all the 50 states. And I think that's where it really needs to be. Because out in many of the Pacific area states, both Washington, Oregon, and California, also Utah, which happens to be Republican, but those are mail-in states. Colorado's a mail-in state. But many other states are more, in fact, some of them are, such as Vermont, really don't do early voting and don't have a big absentee ballot program. It's really show up on election day. And so each one, it's not really so much red state, blue state. It's really what fits the needs of voters in those areas. I think that should be left to local people. The other thing that SR S1 and HR1, the companion bills, what really the mistake they're making is that they've been written by legislators, they've been written by lawyers, people that don't run elections. If you talk to our 159 election directors in Georgia, I think you'd probably get a consensus. This is what makes sense here for Georgia. And so what would probably be is we'd like to make sure we have three options. No excuse absentee voting. That's been embraced by the General Assembly. And I believe that most of the election directors would support that. Early voting. The reason that election directors love early voting is because it really takes that pressure off of the election day. You have now in Georgia up to 19 days in many of the counties to vote early. And really that is very flexible for voters. And that then takes the pressure off of Tuesday voting. And then also we have election day voting. But it's really let the states decide what works best for them. We also want to make sure that we have the appropriate balances of accessibility with security. And I think Georgia has struck the right balance on that.
So following on this question of federalism, most of the money spent on elections has been spent at the state and local levels, but we've had a few exceptions after the 2000 election with the Help America Vote Act. And more recently, a couple of pools of money with security and then for COVID. So one, your thoughts on that, both the place for funding and also the level of funding, whether we need to fund elections more. And then I have a follow-up a bit. Again, it comes from this batch of questions that has come in, and it really asks about the questions of accepting private funding. And just putting it on the table, it asks about money that Zuckerberg's and the foundation put to various jurisdictions across the country to help with elections, whether that worked, made sense, was appropriate. So broadly, federal, state funding, and then this question of private funding.
Well, historically, the county's election officials have felt that they've been really with a tight budget, underfunded. When we had sources of private funding that came during the pandemic with COVID, one of the challenges that we saw in Georgia is that the bigger counties that also had people that were grant writers, they had those people on staff could write the grants to get that sources of funding. But it was really a lifesaver for many of the counties. With SB 202, what they're saying is we can have that money still come into the state, but they'd like to have it come to the centralized authority, and then it would be dispersed out on a per capita basis to all the counties to make sure everyone got some. Many of the counties didn't get a nickel because they didn't have grant writers. They didn't know how to really access that those sources of funds. The larger counties did. And so the General Assembly just would like to make sure going forward that it's really just dispersed throughout the entire state, both rural, urban, and suburban counties on a per capita basis.
So let me take you back to, you mentioned earlier, and the pandemic brought about some changes with respect to voting by mail. Full disclosure, I wrote a book about absentee voting and early voting back 15 years ago. So it's, I come to this honestly. I haven't changed my opinion on these things. But I think Americans, we were more polarized this election than we were in the past. I think there may have been some differences before, but you mentioned Republican and Democratic states. Some of them have moved to lots of voting by mail. Others are more traditional. But certainly voters during the pandemic expressed differences. Democratic voters were much more enthusiastic and felt the need to want to vote by mail. Republicans really felt that they would rather vote in person. Georgia is, I would say, a state that is a strong early voting in person state. Obviously, it has options, all sorts of other options, but has historically been a state that did a lot of that. Where do you see the state going now with the passage of the recent legislation, or just voter attitudes going forward?
I believe that the pandemic exposed to voters for the very first time voting absentee. I voted absentee in the June primary. Then I went back to voting in person. We were historically at 6%. We shot all the way up to about 25%. My guess is that we'll probably settle about 12%, half of what we were, and then twice where we used to be before we had the pandemic. But that's just anyone's guess. But we're going to keep all three options available, and voters get to choose. Giving voters choices is a good thing.
Okay, maybe I could also just ask you generally about the future of voting. Now, of course, we've had the pandemic that's brought new methods about. Some states have radically changed what they're doing. But if you were to look forward in your crystal ball, and I use the term future voting loosely, I guess I might really want to say futures of voting because different states are going to do different things. But what are the trends in voting? What are we likely to see over the next 10 years? And what would you like to see in terms of changes that would improve our election system more at a wholesale level?
Number one, verifiable paper ballots. I think by 2024, every state in the union will have verifiable paper ballots. That's a good thing. That way you can do, if you have to get a really close race like we had here, you can do a 100% hand recount of all those paper ballots. That's key. Number two would be risk limiting audits. We are doing risk limit audits now. Colorado probably led that. Nationwide, it took about 7 to 8 years. We stood ours up in less than a year. And we actually, because we wanted to have a confidence level of 100%, we did a 100% hand recount. But many of the counties have actually begun doing like a 90%, 95% risk limiting level, taking a sample size. We're doing that actually right now with the University of Georgia on the absentee ballots. We did a 99% risk limiting audit with the signature on the envelopes of Cobb County. We're now doing that statewide with UGA, so we can verify what that will be. But we'll be doing that with the actual paper ballots moving forward. And I think risk limiting audits was something put into place with House Bill 316 in 2019 when I first took office. And that was really we didn't realize how much we were going to need that. But that allowed us to do a 100% hand recount of the ballots, which is the risk limiting audit for the presidential race, which could verify the results that President Biden had about 12,000 more votes than President Trump.
Voting technology, you referred to it a bit here, but there were certainly controversies regarding voting technology. And you mentioned both in 2018 and 2020, criticisms of the technology as perhaps being influenced or affected by people. What confidence can you give to voters, to the American public, that what you're doing is transparent enough to them that they can see that the technology works? And what are the proper uses of technology? Where do you think we're using it well, and where do you think we might need a little bit more testing, background certification that would be helpful?
I believe that the Electronic Registration Information Center, ERIC, is really a solid tool to use. First of all, it's led by the states. States can opt in and they could opt out. We've opted in with 30 other states, and we're encouraging every other state to join so that we'll get much better records of deaths and movement of Georgians moving throughout the country, so we can update our rolls objectively. So where we can look for objective measures, I think that's better. And where we can use technology for objective measures, that's I think a solid improvement. I also think with signature match moving away from that and moving towards the driver's license. That's what they're doing in Minnesota. That's what they're doing in red states and blue states. So it's a nonpartisan way of doing it. And so it's very objective, because who can argue with someone's driver's license number with a photo ID? And so I think that's another good way of moving forward. So that's a verifiable way. I don't think we're ready for internet voting. I've talked to many election experts. That may be some version 2030 down the road. But right now, what Georgia has done with the verifiable paper ballot, moving away from signature match, and then also I think automated driver's license, getting registered by automated driver's license services is really good, because what we then have is cleaner list. And the cleaner the list is done through Department of Driver Services, it just makes the process more objective, and it makes you have better data.
You anticipated my next question. I guess I wanted to ask about voter registration. And I think that still many of the things we can improve in our system have to do with that underlies a lot of the controversies that come out of this. You referred to automatic voter registration, and people have some different ideas of what that actually means and whether they like it or not. Can you say something about, well, first, how did voter registration work during the pandemic? Obviously more difficult for people, didn't go to the DMVs as often. So what were your challenges there? But then going forward, Georgia has done things like automatic voter registration. Maybe lay out a little bit what you mean by that. People can feel comfortable with it. Or just broadly, what do we do to make lists accessible? People can get on the lists, but also to keep them very accurate and to make sure that the people on the list are the list of people who are eligible to vote.
When people move to Georgia and they get a driver's license, they'll go through the process and will verify their citizenship, which is very important for everyone that's already registered in Georgia, making sure that you have American citizens, verifying that their address, they are actually moving here and they're on a permanent basis. When you get your driver's license, you will be opted in. You will be registered unless you say, no, don't register me. I want to opt out. So we are an opt-out state, and so you will be opted in and you will be registered. And that's why right now we have 7.7 million plus registered Georgians. So when people talk about doing voter registration drives, there really isn't anyone to register other than people that have just moved here or other than people that have just turned 18. Everyone that wants to vote is probably registered in the state of Georgia right now.
And then in terms of keeping your list current, you mentioned you're part of the ERIC system, which shares data with states to ensure that people who have moved or others you'll know about. But what do you do? And that becomes a source of controversy, was a source of controversy in 2018. What do you say to people about the proper way that states maintain their lists that don't scare people that think that they're pulling people off the list who belong or perhaps not doing enough to keep things up to date?
Well, one of the advantages last year when we sent out to all active registered voters, we sent them absentee ballot applications. We got back several 100,000 of change of address forms or they undeliverable. And so that really then we put on a potential pending list so we couldn't clean up the list while we're in an election cycle, but there'll be also something that we can look at this year. That's very interesting that already, so I talk about how mobile we are, but we had over 200,000 people that we couldn't deliver the mail to them because they obviously had moved out of Georgia or it was an undeliverable address. So that's just the kind of information. And so we are encouraging the counties, and they're going through that process right now of mailing out to all their voters to make sure that their lists are accurate, not to take people off, to make sure they haven't moved. If they moved from one county to another county, we'd like to know that information. You are supposed to update your driver's license, but a lot of people don't do that until they get pulled over by the police. And then they say, is this your current address? They say, no, sir, it's not. Well, that'll be the process when they begin that. But we really want people to make sure they have updated voter rolls. That way we know who we can expect to show up on election day so we can manage the election process. And that's one of the things that is really missing in S1. People haven't really reached out to the county election directors. What would you like to see have in election law? And clean list is one of it so you can manage your election. You know how many people live in your county, how many people live in each one of your precincts.
You've referred to S1 or HR1 several times. Are there? I guess I believe that it's a very large bill. It has a lot in it. Are there issues that you think could be put in the category of election officials want more flexibility on how to implement certain types of processes, and that HR1 and S1 are too specific, too prescriptive? Is there enough room for people, for election officials to do the different types of things that different states are doing, or do you believe that it's too prescriptive and perhaps haven't talked enough to election officials?
I believe they haven't talked enough. They have not talked enough to election officials yet. In fact, a couple years in Georgia, when we had talked about new machines, all the election officials descended in the spring or winter of 2018, and they were very surprised. What, you're talking about new machines? And I remember some of the comments. I hadn't filed my papers yet, running for Secretary of State, but I was watching that whole process. And Secretary of State Brian Kemp then had a commission to really make sure that we made the best decision on what the new system would look like for Georgia. Well, I think maybe what we need to do here is have a pause on S1, HR1, and really make sure we get bipartisan support. If I could give Congress any way of looking at this, is go back to look at what the Carter Center, or President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker did. They formed that bipartisan presidential commission, and they really looked at best practices. Obviously, they didn't agree on everything, but what they came out with was a list of recommendations, and many of those have been implemented since that time. And that's what I would say is make sure we get buy-in from both sides. You made a point about we live in polarized times. We are in a 50-50 nation. And when one person has the 50.1 and is going to shove something down someone else's throat, then what's going to happen as soon as the other side gets power? They're going to want to do the same thing, and it becomes tit for tat. That is not productive. That is not healthy for what I believe is a consensus republic. We need to make sure that we reach across the aisle and build some bipartisanship in the bill. What would you like to see? What do we need to have? And really that hard negotiating with good faith on both sides. Perhaps we need to reconvene that bipartisan commission again before we take another step forward.
Bring up the issue of election lines at the polling place. They've been controversial in different places, controversial in the 2018 election in the primary in Georgia. I worked with the Bauer-Ginsburg Commission back in coming out of the 2012 election, where there was a real worry that we had long lines. So what do you say to people about the problem of lines? And some would point especially to the problem of lines in more urban, more African-American jurisdictions. What's causing them? What can we do to alleviate them? What does the new bill in Georgia say or do regarding that? What would you say to people to reassure them that lines are not going to be as much of a problem as people are worried about?
Well, not to be partisan, but in DeKalb and Fulton counties, those are run by Democrats. The boards have a 3-2 Democrat-Republican split. Sometimes it's 4-1, and the county election directors lean on the left side. So if there's problems there and the Democrats don't like it, they need to be really talking to their county election officials. They come from that side of the aisle. And so to blame that on Republicans is not a fair, or accurate assessment. That said, it does get back to poll worker retention, poll worker recruitment, and poll worker training, and that's very important. During the June primary in Georgia, we did have issues. I don't want to minimize it, but 155 of our counties, of 159, actually had success. We do have a lot of counties. 139 counties during the June primary began at 7 a.m. and finished at 7 p.m. There was about then another 15 counties that had some minor issues, and there was maybe a precinct or two that didn't finish your election at exactly 7 p.m. because of early morning issues. But we did have about 4 or 5 counties that struggled mightily, and that's what hit the national narrative. But since that time, in Fulton County specifically, the county manager of Fulton County, Dick Anderson, stepped in and really came alongside the election director. Dick Anderson came out of a Fortune 500 company. He has tremendous management skill sets, and he came alongside them and they made improvements. Are they where they need to be yet? Not quite, but they did make improvements, particularly on lines. Opening up State Farm Arena and Mercedes. Those were 2 ideas that I received from a fellow from ACLU during my press conference at Park Tavern. We recommended that to Fulton County, and they implemented that. That really helped move the early voting time cycles. They didn't have lines during early voting. That was a good thing. But it's been put into the bill that we will have lines one hour or less. We also then gave every county post-June primary, we looked at what their precincts were set up, how many machines they had, how many precincts that they had, and how many registered voters they had per precinct. And we gave them a green mark, a yellow mark, a red mark, like, can you actually accomplish, if everything worked perfectly, could you work those number of voters through the line? And then they got good data from us, and we said, you can't, these ones won't work here. They came back to us and redid their precincts, redid their numbers of machines. And you look in November, we had great results on election day. We averaged statewide 2 minutes or less. And so we had defeated the issue of long line. And we want to make sure we continue that progress, with all of our counties.
So with the rise of voting by mail, especially this election, people ask questions about the process, the post office, the postal service. Are they serving us well? Are there problems there? Are there problems with individuals getting their ballots in late? What would you say about the way in which we're processing and handling mail ballots, and what you think Georgia wants to do in the future? So what are the issues, and what are the solutions in terms of people who are going to cast their ballot by mail?
Well, number one, the United States Postal Service is a federal responsibility, and it actually goes back to the original Constitution about post roads and post offices. So it's about time Washington figures out what they're going to do to fix it. That's their problem, and they got plenty on their plate just doing that. But that's why last year we stood up the absentee ballot drop boxes. First of all, people wanted to be socially distanced. They didn't want to go into a county election office to drop off their absentee ballots, but also the post office was not reliable. Absentee ballot drop boxes were incorporated for the first time with SB 202 in state law so that they can be used going forward. At least one for every county. During the COVID pandemic, we had 35 counties. Even though we allowed those by state election board ruling under emergency rules, 35 counties did not take advantage of that. Now they have to have at least one per county. Also, then it'll be a population-based one per every 100,000 voters. Now, I do wish, and I've stated this, I wish they would have had a bit more flexibility in that law to have one for every early voting location. It would have worked probably better for the counties, and many of the county election directors have already, been interviewed by the press about that. And I think that's a reasonable position, and hopefully the General Assembly will look at that in future sessions that they might have after we've used this for this coming cycle this year. But I think absentee ballot drop boxes make a lot of sense. Make sure they're under 24/7, surveillance like we had last year with video surveillance. This year with SB 202, they will be under the surveillance of election directors.
So you mentioned, or we've talked a lot about the differences between the parties, the polarization. Are there things that you feel like there's more of a consensus on between the parties that we could move forward, that people aren't talking about as much? Maybe they're not as sexy, but what is it that maybe that both parties could agree on in the various states doing it in various ways that could move forward on election administration?
Well, many bills were filed in Georgia that during this recent general session that we had. Many of the bills were overly restrictive. And both sides were heard, plus also many of our large Georgia public traded companies spoke. So what we did actually was expand early voting by 1 day. What we actually did was we kept no excuse absentee voting. We also then moved away from signature match. We made the case, and I think the General Assembly made a very sound case, that we've been sued by both the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. Let's move to something that's objectively based. Unfortunately, it's become a political hot potato, an election issue. What you can do is hit everyone's emotional hot buttons. And so you call out voter suppression or you call out voter fraud, and you gin up your base and use it as a money-raising scheme. It's been very effective for Stacey Abrams, and it looks like it's been effective for Republicans on the other side, are using that really as a way of generating money for their campaigns moving forward or their PACs. It's unfortunate. What we really need to really encourage both people to really stand down. Let's look at what good policy is. You look at what election directors in both our red counties would like to see, what election directors in our blue counties would like to see, and then build a consensus about that. And I think that we're working hard in Georgia to do that. But when things get misconstrued or people spin things up without actually reading the bill and getting out there on the evening news, it makes it tough. It's what we faced in November. There's some people that have large Twitter accounts or used to have large Twitter accounts. And how do you fight 80 million Twitter followers when our Secretary of State's office, at the time, we probably had maybe 20,000. So we get out there and make our points. They're based on facts. But it takes about several months later when, for example, Sidney Powell's attorney said no reasonable person would conclude that the statements were truly statements of fact, referring to her defamation lawsuit where she's being sued by Dominion Voting Systems. We said it wasn't true. We did a point-by-point rebuttal. We sent that to Congress. But meanwhile, the great lie is out there and people have accepted it as the truth. And that's the challenge we have. And I think still Democrats believe Stacey Abrams and some Republicans believe President Trump's people. And we continue to say to both of them, here's what the facts are. We continue to fight that narrative.
So we're coming to the part of the session where we're going to hear from audience questions. We've already mentioned a few already. We have a whole slew of them coming in, but I want to give you the opportunity to submit some more. Again, you can do so, as you see on the screen, by emailing Nicole Penn, nicole.penn@aei.org, or with the hashtag AEI elections on Twitter. And here's a question. There have been several in this regard, and I think you're going to have to give a little bit of context here, but there have been several people asking why did you sign a consent agreement, a consent decree essentially with Stacey Abrams and her organizations, and not involve the General Assembly. And I think this deals with some of her questions about the 2018 election, especially regarding signature match. But we've had multiple questions asked on that. So what do you say?
Number one, we never signed a consent agreement. What was signed was a settlement agreement. If you go to page 6 of that agreement, you'll look at who signed that. That is signed by the Attorney General of the state of Georgia and also Vincent Russo, who was representing the state election board. Nowhere on that is my signature at all. That's point number one. Number two, in Georgia, unlike other states, say Pennsylvania, which is a commonwealth, the Secretary of State is a constitutional officer, just like the governor and just like the Attorney General, just like our agricultural commissioner. And so within that, within the state constitution, we have our authority, limited, but we do have our authority. The Attorney General has the authority to sign the agreement that he did sign, and it was a settlement agreement. But here's what people need to understand. The settlement agreement, if you read it, it says everything that it will be done by the Secretary of State's office will be in accordance with current state law. And so what that means is that we still did signature match at the time when you did your application. We still did signature match when the absentee ballots came in. We actually made sure that we kept signature match. At the same time that we were fighting the 4 pillars that Mark Elias and the Democrat Party were running across the country doing, we won and defeated all of his 4 pillars. All absentee ballots had to be received by 7 p.m. on election day. The first federal judge said that we had to accept them. We appealed that and we won on appeal. Signature match was done away with in the state of South Carolina. They lost. We actually prevailed and kept signature match. And so it's been misconstrued because it's a red herring. It was really, many people did not run robust absentee ballot chase programs. What I mean by that is Stacey Abrams and the Democrats, if you got your absentee ballot, they were hounding you until you got your absentee ballot in. The Republican Party, the state party in Georgia, didn't have that program. And so when people did their absentee ballot and got it, if they were a Republican, no one was calling them and hounding them to get that in. The Democrats were very effective on it. They had a very good ground game. But if you read the agreement, it was a settlement agreement. It was not a consent agreement. The only consent agreement that I signed last year was against Fulton County after they mismanaged, and that allowed us to actually put a monitor in there for the first time ever. I'm the first Secretary of State to ever get Fulton County and get them under control. We're having a consent agreement, and so I have a monitor there and watch what they were doing. And that's, people have been putting up with Fulton County since 1993, and I'm the first Secretary of State to do something about that.
Okay, here's another question, and this one, I'm not sure I'll read it, it's long, but I will summarize a bit. And I think it actually could be broadened to think about other states as well. It's a little pointed towards Georgia, but it asks about changes that are made closer to election time, or perhaps even after the election, that go against what the state legislature really intended in their election code. And this came up in all sorts of ways, not particularly in Georgia, places like Pennsylvania and others, where critics said that the intent of the people, the intent of the legislatures, the Constitution gives some place to legislatures, had spoken, but judges, election officials, others had changed the election system before election day and really distorted it. And you know, there's a big question of what courts should do. What should the Supreme Court do? Should it step in? Or perhaps questions about in the Electoral College, whether states should submit something more based on what their legislature believes in. So what do you make of, I guess, this big constitutional question, but also secondly, this question of changes that happen in election law, policy, rules fairly close to the election? What should we do about that? Is there a way to keep people confident that the election system is stable and transparent leading up to the election?
Last year in Georgia, and I can only really speak at Georgia, I know there's been lots of questions about Pennsylvania, what happened in Wisconsin and Michigan and states like that. But in Georgia, we followed the state law. We're in a pandemic. The governor declared a state of emergency. We had a national stay-at-home order. Obviously, during the June primary, we had to look at what do we do? How are people going to vote in a pandemic? What we did is we actually sent out absentee ballot applications. Before we did that, we talked to our general counsel, talked to the governor's general counsel, told them what we're going to do, why we're going to do that. They understood. We did the same thing with Lieutenant Governor's office. They understood. Also talked to the Senate President Pro Tem. We actually talked to the Speaker of the House, his staff. They understood what we're going to do. No one had voiced an objection until after we'd done it, and the Speaker of the House voiced an objection afterwards. But this is why we did that. The counties did not have staff able to handle the absentee ballot applications, and all the third-party groups were going to inundate, the voters with multiple applications. You could have gotten 5 to 10 different applications from different organizations. You would get one, you'd fill that out. If you hadn't gotten your absentee ballot, 3 days later, it would take longer than 3 days. Then you get another application, fill that one out because you hadn't got your ballots yet, and we continue on. But the counties did not have the staff in place to do that. So we went ahead and we then, had a process, a uniform process. We'd send out one application to every voter, and because you had to require to send out actually an application. But also, if we did not do something, we did run a great risk that a federal judge was going to come down and say, you need to go ahead and send out live ballots. And we wanted to make sure we got ahead of that in the application process, that made sure that we had a uniform process, something that was manageable. As it was, many of the counties really had trouble with that because they were getting in applications over the internet with TIFF files and other files that they couldn't read. But make sure we had a uniform process so people could vote in the June primary. As it was, we had to postpone the presidential primary, and we pushed it out one date, and we had to postpone it another 3 weeks later before we were finally ready because somewhat of the COVID situation was under control. Other than that, we stood up an online portal which connected for the absentee ballot applications for the fall location, connected people to driver service, which was photo ID, which is in effect what's been incorporated with SB 202. We made sure that we kept all 3 options open: absentee, early voting, day of election. Some states went 100% to absentee voting. We didn't do that in Georgia. You could vote early, you could vote on the day of election, or you could vote absentee with no excuse absentee voting. If you don't like no excuse absentee voting, guess what? That was put in place in 2005, and 2 of the people that voted for that were the Speaker of the House, David Ralston, and the former senator, who's now the current party chairman, David Schaefer. I actually don't support no excuse absentee voting, and also I didn't support that it was done with signature match. But I'm not going to second guess them. That was put in place in 2005.
So here's a broader question. Actually, it comes all the way from Finland via Washington, D.C., from Sana Kangasharju. And she asks, looking back, knowing what you know now in the 2020 election, how it unfolded, is there anything you would do differently?
Well, the way I run my construction business, we write letters to general contractors, and we put it in writing what our positions were. And when we told each of those corners, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor's also, I would have put it out in writing. This is what we plan to do. And I would have sent that same letter to the Democrat Party, the Republican Party. If you have any objection with that, please let us know in 24 hours because we need to move on this process very quick because we got out those absentee ballot applications within less than 10 days. It's unbelievable. But if they would have had a problem with it, then they could have responded back in writing to us instead of coming back later doing this armchair quarterback, Monday morning quarterbacking. That's the only change I would have made because what was happened afterwards was not honest from one of those sections. And I've been very clear about that. Well, a lot of that goes back to local Georgia politics. We had what's called a jungle primary, and that was for the U.S. Senate. The governor has the power to pick who he wants when a seat becomes empty, and he chose Senator Loeffler. That was his choice. What the speaker actually wanted inside baseball is he wanted a partisan primary because he favored Doug Collins. It was the governor's choice, and we've had a jungle primary like we've had for a long time. And that's how it shook out. But resentment was directed towards our office, and we didn't have a say in that. The governor made the choice. We had a jungle primary in the fall, and then we had a runoff election, obviously, in January. But between Senator Loeffler and the Democrat opponent. But we ended up taking some heat for that because we didn't, bend to the wishes of the speaker. We, followed we understood our positional power, and we also understood the positional power of the governor. The governor has an awful lot of power in Georgia. I understand that from being in the General Assembly. I also recognize the speaker has a tremendous power, so does the lieutenant governor. We all have our roles to play, and I try and respect everyone's positional power.
So we're coming to the end of our time. So I guess I'm going to return for maybe a last comment from you back to your piece that we started with. Again, the piece in National Affairs in spring 2021, the assault on trust in our elections. What can we do if you're worried, I think rightly so, that the average person and candidates of high note are worried about the integrity of elections? They think that elections may not be, the outcomes may not, they don't accept them. What are the things that we can do? What are the big things, the big takeaways? Give us a more hopeful note on things that would help us get to a place where there is more belief in the results of elections by candidates, by the American people.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's shown that I'll stand up to the pressure. I'm going to ensure that in Georgia, we're going to have honest and fair elections with that appropriate balance of security with also accessibility. And the glue that holds that all together is integrity. I think that when we look at big, major federal legislation, sometimes we need to pause and make sure we get buy-in from everyone. I understand that if you have more votes, I was on city council and I was told to count to 4. We had a 7-person mayor and council. So I understand that. But I also understand that you have to really make sure you get buy-in, make sure that it's a fair process. I think that the bipartisan commission we had in 2005, probably I would really encourage our federal officials, our national leadership to go ahead and reconvene that. I don't know who you'd have on this side, I don't know who you'd have on that side. Thoughtfully consider who you'd want to put there. People respected, from the right, people respected on the left, but sit there and really do the hard work, because it is hard work, of reaching a consensus, because we're not going to agree on everything, but get a broad consensus on what we do. That should really be what we do moving forward. Also, the National Association of Secretary of State had trusted info. It was really information that was bipartisan, nonpartisan information, to make sure you get trusted information. Our office, everything that we put out, if you look at everything we say, it is fact-based. When people say that the machines flip vote, we did 100% recount. We sent a 10-page letter to Congress, point-by-point rebuttal of everything that Trump campaign put out. That is part of the national record. It unfortunately got there on January 6th, and folks were busy with some other issues on that day. But we want to make sure that everything we put out, that we can put our hand up and swear that what we're saying is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If we are called, into deposition, we can support it with facts. And that's what you need to look at. Is what they're saying supported on facts, or is it just based on emotions and feelings? Don't let people play with your emotions. This stuff is too serious. It is your priceless franchise to vote. And I'm not going to do anything. I understand our history of Georgia. I want everyone to be able to vote. I want to make sure we have honest elections. And that's what I'll continue to fight for in Georgia.
Secretary Brad Raffensperger, thank you for your piece, The Assault on the Trust in Our Elections and National Affairs, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.